So, Soren, I met you a couple of years ago when Meng suggested that we talk, and I trust Meng's judgment, so I said, all right, I'll meet him. And then after we spoke, you suggested lunch, I think, or coffee, or tea it would have been for you.
It's usually my
coffee
maneuver.
for me. And I said yes, and then you suggested another lunch, and I said yes. And I kept saying yes to lunches and conferences and talks and coffees. And I don't always do that. So it strikes me that I'm in a room full of people, many of whom have been saying yes to you for a long time. So I tried to think about what is it about you that brings out the yes in me and in our friends here. And I have one answer I want to test on you, and then I want to hear your answer. Your work is very well aligned with you as a person. And in combination, you have this incredible vision. And those two things, to me, really bring out the yes. But I think that alignment of work with you as a person is something we all strive for. So I'm wondering if you think that's true first, and if so, how you got there.
I'm going to pause. I think people are really looking to be met and to be seen, and to not have a too strong of an agenda overriding that, and that particularly in the tech world, the meetings are often agenda-based. How do I get this person to do X, Y, Z, get funding, fund, whatever that agenda is. And then that overrides just the moment-to-moment experience of you or of two people together. And when people feel seen and met just in that moment, as if that moment is complete and enough in and of itself, I think there's this general just expansion of the heart and openness and willingness because it's so rare, I think particularly in the business community where we're always trying to get stuff done. And so I think whenever that quality of presence and connection and being met is there, then there's this openness that happens. So usually my invitation to people who come to the conference is like, to the extent you can let go of whatever agenda you came bringing here, and actually just meet people and see people for as they are, even if they aren't a venture capitalist that's going to fund your company. So you're just open and kind to them. Most likely they'll find a friend who's a venture capitalist to help you fund your company. But just you have to be open, or else if you're agenda-based and that overrides, then people, I feel like, just close down, their system becomes untrustworthy. So I do feel like that's at play. So to whatever extent I'm living that, that I feel like happens. And I also feel like within the tech community, so many of the conversations that people were asked to have were about, you know, how's Twitter going to beat Facebook? How's Google going to compete with whatever? And there weren't questions that actually the founders and the leaders of that company weren't really that passionate about, because that wasn't what really drove them. What drove them was this larger vision. So Wisdom 2.0 came along, and they were like, wow, here's actually a platform where I can talk about what's really important to me. So I feel like there was both of those things happening, where there was an energy and feels like there was this need to have a deeper conversation about where our culture is going, and a real ache in the tech community for joining that conversation. Does that do it somewhere?
Yeah, it makes sense. And I think the first thing you said about seeing and hearing the person without needing something from them is certainly part of what keeps people saying yes to you. So you and I have talked a lot about these conferences and events that you create, and Soren teases me because last year I said, what's the theme? I want to make sure whatever I do is aligned with your theme. And he said, Karen, whatever emerges, that's the theme. Roll with it. You know?
Yeah.
And so you talk a lot about your role in creating a container, and I think of it as a very permeable container, but a container nonetheless from which spectacular things can emerge. But if you take yourself beyond the role of creating the container for a minute, in your wildest dreams, what would emerge from this container, this Wisdom 2.0 container?
Oh, but even beyond my wildest dreams, I don't think my dreams could reach that far. So what happened was Karen was interviewing John Kabat-Zinn last year, and she said, well, what's the theme of the conference so I can make sure to ask my questions related to that theme? And I said, the theme is the same theme as it is every year, and it's to follow life. So if you're asking John a question, all of a sudden he sparks, like you see life in them, go with that. And who cares if it actually relates to the title of the conversation? Go where there's energy and go where there's spark. And when I think about what happens often at Wisdom 2.0, and I think of people like Arturo, who I think is still here, Arturo, and the things that then he takes and then brings into Facebook, I could have never dreamed that up. So I feel like what you all create from having this space to meet people authentically and to hear from the speakers that we have is actually far beyond whatever dream I could come up with. Because people then take information and use it in ways that are beyond anything I can imagine. So I hope that's not a cop-out.
It's a total cop-out.
It's a total cop-out?
It's beautiful.
I mean, I guess, so my wildest dreams would be that happens tenfold. Yeah.
Yep. Let's hear it for tenfold.
Yeah.
All right, I'll give you the cop-out. We talked about this, how far can I push you on. But what's fascinating to me is your consistent commitment to the platform that you're creating. Like, that's the contribution that you really want to make. And to define the outcomes for you feels like it restricts the potential of the container or the potential of the platform. And there's something sacred to you, in my experience of you, about not putting words to or creating vision around what comes, because somehow that might limit it. Like, if it would put it in an earthly form, it then would limit it to being earthly.
So the big question is that really true, or is that just part of my own personality
resistant
quirk?
strategy?
Resistant strategy. I think the jury's out.
Let the audience decide.
My lack of, my fear of making decisions. It's uncertain. One of those two are probably true, though.
Probably true. Maybe a little bit of both. So we've toggled at this conference back and forth between, the individual change level and what each of us is doing to be our best self, and the societal change and Marianne's challenge to us to take responsibility for the world that we're living in. I want to bring it to the personal for a moment with you and ask you, what are some of the individual level strategies that you use to stay centered and to stay focused, that challenge that all of us have every day to show up wholly? How do you do that?
I have a couple of things. Well, one is larger. So everybody who generally speaks up here, there was definitely people this year I didn't know. Like, we did a panel with veterans from different parts of the country. I'd never met them before Tulsi. I just met, briefly. But for the most part, everybody who's up here is a friend. They're people I've spent time with. There's people I'd like to spend more time with. So it's not like I'm doing something with a bunch of nothing against executives, but I'm doing something with a bunch of executives that I really wouldn't want to hang out with otherwise. And I think that actually really helps me feel a sense of purpose, in a sense that I'm not really going to work. I'm actually in communication with people who align. And so I really try really hard to keep Wisdom 2.0 with people who have a real good intention in the world. And if they're wanting to kind of have this more promotional bent, it's just not a fit. It doesn't mean it's wrong or bad. It's just not a fit within this context. And I think people here really feel the level of passion and heart. And it's not just about intelligence and knowledge. And so much of our world is about intelligence or knowledge. Well, I have all this knowledge, I need to present it. And so they present their knowledge and feel like, wow, shouldn't I be given all this credit because I have so much information? And I actually feel like the information is freely available, but the heart and the compassion and the care, to me, that's where the real juice is. And so we really look for people who share both of those, can walk both of those paths. Because if it's just about information, I think we all know it just gets dry.
Right.
And it's not very fun.
And what about in between the conferences? What are some of the things that you do every day or regularly that
I love to walk in the woods. Arturo and I go, I'm going to pick on Arturo. Arturo, we and I go for like a walk in the woods for 2 hours every month. And I have other friends, too, who invite me to go out. And instead of constant emailing back and forth what's going on with us, we have these times where we're just like, cool, let's go for our walk. And like, I know everything I need to tell Arturo, I've got these 2 hours. And I don't need to email him all the time because I'll have this like in-person time with him where we can connect. And that and I don't know how good I love projects. I'm a project guy. I love starting things. I love building things. So inevitably, I get a lot of excitement from that. This is a bit overkill, maybe, going from like 600 to 1600, so it can definitely be a challenge. But I found, which is true this year, which is amazing people. We have an amazing team that just emerge to allow certain things to happen. So I generally tend to be very action-oriented, but I just, for me, it's like there's that whole level of being. And I used to be an activist in the environmental movement, and there were people who really cared, and the level of anger and just conflict that existed when people have different views of the world, and they're very attached to what those views are. And how do we take action really with heart and compassion, and not really making enemies, and not really putting our agenda onto somebody else? That's the question I have. What actually that looks like, I'm not so clear. For me, it's about listening to, so when I was, Eckhart, who was up here earlier, when I was going through a really hard time in my life, I'd lost my job, I was going through a divorce, and just didn't have much. And Eckhart, I was reading a lot of Eckhart, and Eckhart had said at some point, he said, don't ask what you want to do, ask what the world wants to do through you. And I remember asking that for about a year. What does the world want to move through me? And I knew I had these two interests, and then at some point it just like popped. And I was like, this was it. I knew nobody in tech. I didn't know anybody. This was 4 years ago. I didn't know a soul. Wow. I knew a few people through Twitter. But it just felt like the universe had put this on the plate. And I feel like that's happening to a lot of people now, where what they're doing, they know isn't really the alignment. And they're trying to create space in their lives for something to come through. But in order for something to come through, we have to create the space. If we're just online, keeping ourselves busy all the time, or not really creating the space for that to come through, I think it's very hard for us to really know what that action is.
So talk a little bit more about that, because I think people, here do want to understand from you. So 4 years ago, you had a sense of what the world wants to do through you. How did you then create the space, and how did you know which voices to listen to? What were some of the steps that you took, either hard lessons that you learned or things that you said, that really worked, I'd like to share that advice with others, kind of along your journey?
Okay, so two things. I'll say one other thing, and then we'll come back to that.
Okay.
So just to use Eckhart's example, he talks about you have two purposes. You have your primary purpose, which is to always be present right now, the only moment we have. And then a secondary purpose, which is what is the action or movement that wants to come through you into the world? So it might be to start a business, it might be to leave a business, it might be to start something. So both of those exist. However, if the secondary purpose, the action in the world, ever becomes more important than the primary purpose, being present, we're off, because now we're living life like ahead of ourselves. So for me, that practice has always been, can I actually really be in the moment, and at the same time listen to the thrust that's moving forward? So it's not a thrust that's like I have to prove myself, but it's actually a thrust from a larger movement coming at me. And so I feel like whatever people take on, if they're in touch with that, and if they're actually meeting somebody, not with this expectation that something's going to happen in the future, but they're really just meeting them, that just opens doors. That it's weird. It's like once you no longer need it, it can give it to you. But as long as you're needing it and you're a little unsatisfied, it's like it doesn't, somehow the universe just like, I can't play that game with you. But if I'm just there with you and I'm meeting you and I'm present with you, and the universe feels like, oh, I can trust this guy. Let's move something forward with them.
It's very interesting. So you lean back enough and stay present enough that people can lean into you, and then you can pick up where they are.
Yeah, and for me, like when I started this, people would be like, well, how can you get the founder of this whatever company? I mean, now we're kind of established a little bit, so it's not as hard, but in the early days, And I would often just ask that question, and I'd say, well, at the end of our lives, what's really going to matter to us? And we're talking about that. And I just found like that's a really hard thing to say no to.
Right. There's the advice, right? Develop the compelling ask.
Develop a heartful, sincere, compelling ask that speaks to that part of them that wants that too. Yeah. So, but it can't be a strategy. I feel like it actually has to be genuine.
It has to be authentic.
Yeah. Otherwise. So now we're in a different phase of our world, which is a little bit different in terms of Wisdom 2.0. Where there was this phase where it's like, how could we get the founders of all these tech companies to come and speak? Wouldn't that be amazing if they actually talked about wisdom and compassion? So now we did that. And so it feels like it's entering a new chapter. And the new chapter is, I think, very much about what happened today, which is there's also these other domains. And how do we begin to support that? And I feel like knowing the right question to ask is huge, and sitting with the right question to ask is huge. And if we're sitting with this question of like, how can I just consume as much information as I can all the time, it's that question really doesn't really make a lot of space. But if the question is, how do I actually live with meaning and purpose, and how can technology be an aid in how I show up in the world and how I do my work in the world, then that allows a different result to come forth.
I want to see if there's time there is for you to say a little bit more about that. So you're giving a talk soon about how we can not be victim to our technology, but really use it toward our greater purpose. So say more about how you see us sort of flipping the bit on who has the power, the phone or the person.
Well, so a couple things. One is, so there's people I know who are online probably 10 hours a day, right? Or more. But they're so committed to what they're doing, right? I mean, there's this passion and there's energy. So it's really hard to say you should spend this time online and not this time. And there's other people who are spending those 10 hours online, and it's not very fulfilling to them. They're bored, they're lonely, they're hurt, and they're avoiding their feelings by going and doing whatever they do online. And there's other people who see some social change or some action, or they're really passionate about their company. And so I don't think we can take these like things and say this is good and this is bad. All I think we can do is really invite people to be aware of what's going on in their body and what's going on in their mind, and inquire as to how that can be brought forth into the world. And I think it's so easy to take a stance and say, well, everybody needs to do X, Y, or Z. And stances just to me aren't very exciting. I don't think they really create a lot of passion or a lot of enthusiasm. And to do this, at least in the early stages, it took a kind of a leap of faith. So a friend of mine, when I first got this idea, a friend of mine said, so can you narrow down your target audience? And he's like, do you want to reach HR executives? Do you want to reach entrepreneurs? Who do you want to reach? And then you can market your material to reach just that specific group. So he said, who do you want to reach? I said, everybody interested in wisdom and compassion in the digital age. And he said, no, you can't reach them. You need to find a certain area and like target your message and create language that targets your message to a specific audience. I said, well, the audience is anybody interested in wisdom and compassion in the area. He's like, but where do you find them? And so there was this sense not of possibility, right? But like I was pretty clear that like there was a conversation in a community that was wanting to show up and wanting to be. It was an intuition. Yeah. And I just continue to trust that intuition. And at some point, it may be that I'm not the best carrier of that through this current mode. But so far, I'm enjoying myself.
Yes, absolutely. So, speaking of intuition and thinking about this conference next year, do you have any early intuitions around next phases of the life of this?
So, just so everybody know, most of the great ideas come from other people. So, Jack's interview the last time that happened with Bill Ford was through just Jack's idea, and I was like, sounds good. And then people look to give me credit for things that happen. And particularly as the community grows, most of the ideas come from other people. Mm-hmm. You already had an idea. Told me yesterday.
It's true.
And so it feels like now it's actually, I put in some ideas too, but mainly I have dialogues and it emerges. Mm-hmm. So that's even if I have some idea now, it really doesn't matter because the conversations need to happen, and through the conversations, I remember this person, he told me, he said he was in an intentional community. And he said, we try not to make decisions. We try to recognize decisions. Mm. And I try and do that too. I try not to make decisions. I try to recognize decisions. Mm-hmm. And you hear something, it's like, yeah, it just feels right. So it'll evolve. I feel like it'll evolve, and the beauty of it is it asks us to be present and listen. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I have no idea what's going to happen.
That's great. So back to this year, this conference, I have the absolute honor of sitting with you as things come to a close. What are some of the moments, just a smattering of moments that have inspired you or brought incredible joy to your heart as you've experienced this? And it could be an in-between moment or a private moment or a listening moment. Yeah. What absolutely captured you?
Well, there's a number of things. One is walking around the space and actually seeing everybody. We've always had this vision for what if we had a meditation room? What if we had a yoga room? What if we had hosted conversations and people could go and talk amongst themselves? And what if we had all these different things? And it's like, wow.
They're doing it.
And what if we had cool stars hanging from the ceiling?
Yeah.
So a lot of that opportunity here, we finally were able to do. And so there's a certain satisfaction that people actually went and did all those things, and so they wouldn't have to be here all the time.
Thank you all for doing that.
Yeah,
for Soren to have his moment.
Made me feel much better. So there's definitely a satisfaction about that, and there's a certain satisfaction when I feel like different voices are allowed to be. So if you spent the first day, we had Evan Williams, who started Twitter, and Jeff Weiner from LinkedIn, who just talked really powerfully about how they're creating their companies and the role of technology. And then people like Sherry Turkle, who really speaks to a different side of it. And then Jack and John Kabat-Zinn, who can speak more to the meditative space. And then Marion Williamson, who's can speak more to the action space. And it's all within a container. And what is best for each person to hear, I don't know. But I actually get a certain satisfaction in allowing different voices to emerge that at some point could seem contradictory, but it's very important that the voices are there. And so I feel like the platform needs to be able to hold these different energies. And whether it's a softer voice or whether it's a fiery voice, they're all just these expressions. And the real art and the real practice, I feel like, is for each person to take that in and to listen to themselves and to see how that needs to be integrated in.
Did anything surprise you?
Marion surprised me a bit. I wasn't sure where she's going to go.
I feel like I should jump out of my chair.
Yeah, it's a little bit like, okay. It's funny because as an organizer, you want control, just so you know. And it's often when you let go of control that things need to happen, right? Yeah. It's like trying to control certain things. It's like, all right, this is not going to be controlled.
Yeah. That might be an understatement, but that was really good.
So that's always a lesson in creating structures, creating things, but then allowing. When I talked to her about speaking, I said, "We'll just give you the floor." And she's like, "Do you have anything you want to speak on?" I was like, "Whatever you feel like needs to be said in the room. I want you to just tune into the room and speak what you think needs to be spoken." And when you ask somebody to do that, they're going to do it.
Yeah.
So there's different energies like that that I feel like were a little surprising. Jeff Weiner, when we interviewed him, I was surprised that he wants to spend so much time talking about compassion and not other things. So what I try to do is I never know what's most alive for a person until I sit down with them in that moment. And you can read all the blog posts, you can read all their books, you can read everything they've ever done, but you're only really going to know what's most alive when you sit in the moment together. Mm-hmm. And so for me, that's why this is always an interesting discovery, is what actually happens when two people sit down, mm-hmm. and then they actually feel your presence, because your presence determines what is said. So we can do all this planning, but the field actually is speaking to itself. Right. And so what the field needs to say really is only known once everybody's here. And as I had mentioned early on, the quality of what's happening in everybody's mind and hearts then touches who's ever here looking at those hearts and minds. And so it all evolves into something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. So the work that you do and the work that you've done has touched me and has touched everyone here and all of those who are watching us online, and by extension touches our circles and allows us to go and have impact and be stronger versions of ourselves and more thoughtful and more aware. So I want to ask everyone here to join me in a very heartfelt thank you to Soren for creating this change in us and by extension in those whom we love and touch. So thank you.